Welcome back to the Academy and ROTC Insider podcast featuring Lieutenant Colonel Kirkland and myself, Captain Dach.
Great to be back, and really looking forward to today's talk about the Department of Defense Medical Exam Review Board, or otherwise known as DoDMERB.
Our intent here is to help you understand how the Department of Defense Medical Exam Review Board, and then also the academies, as well as the ROTC programs, handle disqualifications, because it's never going to be the same. This is such a complex topic. We could talk about this topic for days on end. It's such a unique part of the Academy and ROTC application process. And it's the most confusing and the most overwhelming for a lot of people.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's so confusing that I wrote a 160-page book on it that's out on Amazon, and you can also get on our websites. It was one of those things where we really felt like we need to get something like this out.
One of the most interesting parts about DoDMERB is that there's no cookie cutter answer. If somebody went through something in a previous year, or even if they're in the same year as you and you're disqualified, each situation is going to be handled differently.
Every single service seems to have its own ways of giving waivers to DoDMERB disqualifications.
Definitely. Our goal is to just really help prospective cadets and midshipmen and their families understand what the process is, but more importantly, if you are going to be disqualified, yes or no, and then if you are, what to do about it. So that's what we're trying to just barely touch the surface on today at a very high level. What is DoDMERB? How would you explain DoDMERB?
DoDMERB is the Department of Defense Medical Exam Review Board. It's located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. They have about, I'd say, 30 people total in the organization. Department of Air Force civilians. So it's a fairly small organization that evaluates over 20,000 candidates a year. They have a big job that this small Department of Defense agency has, but a very important job.
It's very easy for students and families to get confused when it comes to those 30 to 45 people sitting in Colorado Springs compared to who is making the waiver decision. And that's a really important distinction that I just want to highlight up front, is that DoDMERB determines whether or not you're qualified, but it's a very black and white process, and they have no say into whether or not you're offered a waiver. So very important to keep in mind that you're not trying to convince DoDMERB that you deserve the waiver. You're trying to convince the Academy or ROTC program.
We'll be talking about that as we go through this 10-step process that we lay out for how to get qualified. Hopefully it will clarify the process for people listening. All right, so the 10-step process is our simplified process on how to get medically qualified. This starts even before you begin the medical qualification process. You don't even have to have applied to the Air Force Academy or to Army ROTC or Navy ROTC. You can determine this if you're a freshman or sophomore or in high school, as a matter of fact, because you generally know your medical situation and you can determine really ahead of time whether or not you're going to be running into any problems with DoDMERB disqualification. Before you begin this process, you'd be best advised to do some research, right? And so that research really starts with DoDI, or Department of Defense Instruction 6130.03, okay, which is basically the medical standards qualification. And this has pretty much every single possible medical issue, okay, that you could run into and what the standards are that would disqualify you from that particular medical issue that you might have. So if you really have a concern about that medical disqualification, or you think you might have something that's a problem, then go to DoDI 6130.03, look up your particular issue, and then you can pretty much figure out if that's disqualifying or not. And so obviously there's hundreds of possible medical disqualifications that you could face.
We have every disqualification listed out on our website, and that's linked below. So you can go and you can actually go to that page and you can search the page and you can see if there's a specific disqualification. But you should also read DoDI 6130. An example of A disqualifying criteria or condition from DODI 6130.03 is asthma. And so here is a very specific text. A history of airway hyperresponsiveness, including asthma, reactive airway disease, exercise-induced bronchospasm, or asthmatic bronchitis after the 13th birthday. It's very clear. It's very cut and dry. If you have anything that would lead to asthma or reactive airway disease after the 13th birthday, you are going to be disqualified.
Another thing that you should be planning for is not just doing an overview of what could be disqualifying, but when you're going to start. And so it really depends. For the academies, if you're a competitive candidate and you fill out a certain amount of the forms, then you'll be asked to start your DoDMERB physical, right? And then for the ROTC, whether that's Army, Navy, or Air Force, once you are awarded a scholarship, about within a week of when you're awarded that scholarship, you'll then get notification that to start your DoDMERB physical. Now, if you're applying to the academy and you're applying to ROTC, keep in mind that that's the same DoDMERB physical. So if you've already started with the academy, there's no reason to restart it with ROTC.
The second step is completing the online questionnaire. And this, you actually create your account with DoDMETS. So once you've done enough where the academies feel like you have completed enough and you're a serious candidate, or you've earned an ROTC scholarship, you will receive an email to log into your DoDMETS account. And we've been talking about DoDMERB, but DoDMETS is an online program where you fill out the questionnaire and you manage your appointments that you're going to have to accomplish. So for the online questionnaire, the really important thing here is that there's about 114 questions on this online questionnaire, and you answer yes or no to these questions. And it's basically, let's stick with our asthma example. Do you have a history of asthma? Yes or no? If you say no, very cut and dry, you move on to the next question. If you say yes, you're going to be answering more questions about that. When were you diagnosed? Are you on medication? Is it resolved? All of these types of questions. But the most important thing here is that once you save a yes and you move on to the next page, that is final. So if you're unsure and you're filling out this questionnaire, it's very, very important that parents are doing this with students, because students don't quite typically understand the significance of saying that they have a condition, and maybe they're confused. But once you say you have this condition, it's very difficult to get DoDMERB to understand that you don't have it. So very, very critical component. And families should absolutely be filling out these questionnaires together. Go through those questions together. And you're also going to have to utilize doctors' addresses and names and phone numbers too. You want to collect all that information when you start to fill out the online questionnaire. Now, once you fill out the questionnaire, then it's time to schedule your in-person exams. And that will be an optometrist as well as a physical exam. And these are with government contracted doctors. The amount of time between when you submit your online questionnaire and when you're able to schedule really depends on what time of year it is, if you're in a location with a lot of options or not. I've seen as quickly as a week, but as late as 6 weeks. So it's better to plan ahead and get this done early, so that way you have plenty of time to schedule your exams. I would say the average is anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks from the time you fill out the questionnaire to be able to go and schedule those exams. So once you've scheduled the exams, the next step is to attend them.
Make sure that before you go into the physical exam and your eye exam, that you make sure you follow any directions on the DoDMETS website. And so like one example would be contact lenses. So if you have just removable, permeable contact lenses, I believe you have to take them out a few days before the exam. If you have ortho K lenses, you got to take them out 90 days beforehand. Be careful with following the directions, particularly with the optometrist portion of this. So there's no reason to bring any records to the exam. One of the things that we recommend to candidates is that before you attend your medical exam, that you do a full body check of yourself head to toe. Make sure that you don't have any rashes or a bad cold or something like that may be misconstrued as a medical issue. For example, about 4 years ago, we had a candidate who had a rash and went to the medical exam, and the doctor said that the person had eczema, and then they were disqualified for a history of eczema, which When they say a history of eczema, that means any time that you've had eczema, that would be a history of eczema. So you just want to make sure you're of good sound mind and body, that you do a full body check of yourself before you go into the exam. So you'll go into your medical exam. They'll do a read aloud test to make sure you're not a stutterer. You may want to practice the paragraph that you'll find in our DoDMERB book. Just practice that test ahead of time. If you stumble over words, these people are not medical specialists. They're general practitioner doctors that are in your local community. They go through a checklist. They just want to make sure you're of sound mind and body, that you don't have anything that may be of concern to them. They also will note like scars on your body, any place on your body that may indicate that you've had a operation or maybe self-harm or anything like that, of indications like that. And then you'll go to your optometry exam and they'll dilate your pupils and give you a optometry exam. So what happens is after your physical exam and eye exam, that those two exams, as well as your questionnaire, are sent electronically to DoDMERB, okay, at Colorado Springs that we talked about earlier. And so you should be checking on your DoDMETS site to make sure that both the optometrist and the medical doctor send that paperwork up to DoDMERB.
So you just accomplished your physical and eye exam, and that takes us to step 4, which is pending decision. There's no decision yet. We're waiting to hear whether or not you're going to be qualified or disqualified, or they need additional medical information. And like you were saying, sir, I would check this every day if I was a student waiting, because I can't tell you, I want to say it's 30%. I mean, it's probably not 30%, but it just seems like it happens so much, where a doctor doesn't check the right box, or they forget to date a piece of paper, or they forget to put their signature on the right piece of paper. And something really small and insignificant holds up the approval process. I've seen it be held up for months because students just didn't realize that they were held up. So it's very critical that you're checking your status. Let's walk through some of the statuses. Okay. So you want to log into DoDMET and you will see 6 different statuses. The first one is auto approved, meaning you are cleared to log into DoDMERB. The Academy or ROTC has said, yes, this student is competitive or has earned a scholarship, so let's push them to DoDMERB. And then pending. Pending means you've completed your application, the questionnaire online, and you have scheduled dates in the system. And it's really critical that for these dates, you actually went in and you told DoDMETS that you had scheduled dates. They will change your status if you've attended both exams. So you've attended your both exams and you see a pending and it's been longer than 10 days, something is wrong. And this is time for you to call what's called the CIV team. So they're the DoDMETS, and you can log into your portal and you can call this phone number and you can find out what's going on. But the reality is that sometimes doctors do not sign paperwork and resend it in. So they did it the first time, something was wrong, it gets kicked back, and then it just sits there pending. It's really important that if that happens, you at least call the doctor's office, but I would recommend going in and trying to get them to correct any errors in the paperwork, because the longer it sits there, that just means you're not going to know whether or not you're qualified or disqualified. This is especially critical if that you have a condition that you're going to be disqualified with. So once it moves from pending, that the next step is complete, meaning that they have both of your exams, everything looks good, and they are going to send it off to the academy, and that's when it changes to closed, meaning both exams have been received, reviewed, and sent to DoDMERB. And at this point, it generally takes 2 to 4 weeks for DoDMERB to make a determination. So once your status is closed, then DoDMETS is out of the picture, and now you can log in to your DoDMERB account, which is a separate account. So there's lots of accounts here, and you can go in and you can monitor your status there. So, sir, then we move on to step 5, which is DoDMERB determination phase.
Now, DoDMERB's got your medical questionnaire, medical history questionnaire, and your medical exam and your vision test. So they then go through the standards, 6130.03. And so they look at anything that you answered yes to on the medical history questionnaire. And then they make a determination of whether or not you meet the standard or don't meet the standard for anything that you answered yes to on the questionnaire, or what was discovered in the medical exam or the vision test that may be an issue. So they go through all the standards. Now, the people that do this are Department of the Air Force civilians. They are not doctors. So what they do is they simply take 6130-03, look at the specific standards that disqualify you for that particular issue, and then decide on whether or not you're qualified or disqualified based on the standards. And we talked about the standards earlier about asthma, right? And so if you say yes to asthma and they go to 6130.03 and you don't meet the standards, they will then issue you a disqualification for that particular issue. Now, you may be asked to do a remedial, which means that you'll get a notification from DoDMERB that will say, we need more medical information from you in order to make a determination whether or not you're qualified or disqualified. It usually involves additional medical records that you have to provide or prescription records. And it may also involve a trip to a specialist, perhaps. But most of the time, it involves just sending in additional medical documentation so that the specialist at DoDMERB, along with a doctor that they may consult, will determine whether or not you meet the qualification or disqualification. So I think the important thing with this is that DoDMERB, these are not medical doctors. They look at the standard, they determine medical qualification or disqualification based on that standard, right? They are not looking at shades of gray here. They're not looking at mitigating issues. So it's strictly qualification or disqualification. If you're qualified and you meet in every single standard, you'll be DoDMERB qualified at that point. However, if you're disqualified, you then move to the next step, which is awaiting a waiver initiation.
I just like to be the voice of hope for students and parents out there who know they're going to be disqualified. If you're going to be disqualified, it's not the end of the road. I would say probably a fifth of all the programs all require candidates require waivers. So it's not uncommon to be disqualified. The most important thing is to take action early and to not just let the process happen to you, but to know going into this process that you are going to be disqualified, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged. There are some conditions that are going to be very hard to be waived, but a lot of them, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So the step 6, you have been disqualified in step 5. So step 6 comes along and you are awaiting whether or not you are going to be granted a waiver. Now, this step only applies to the academies because if you're in ROTC and you've earned that scholarship, you're already competitive. They've already given you the scholarship. They've already looked at you and said yes. So that will happen automatically. So step 6 is for the academies only. But essentially, this is the step where they may not pursue a waiver. And so the admissions teams for the academies are going to look at you and determine if you're competitive or not. The important thing to know is that this process is not automatic. And if it's still before the deadline date for the academies, improving your application as much as possible and making yourself as competitive as possible is going to help admissions see that, yes, you are a competitive candidate and you should move to the waiver consideration phase. So the admissions team is separate from the individual or the physician who's making the decision about whether or not to offer you the waiver. And so that's a really important key, is that just because you need a waiver does not mean that the physician at West Point is going to look at your file. Admissions has to say, yes, I want you, doctor, to look at this candidate's file and make a determination about whether or not they should be waived. And sir, what's the biggest bang for the buck that candidates can take in terms of action to make themselves competitive for admissions to say, yes, I want to waive this candidate?
Well, I would say raise your SAT score or ACT score, I'd say. Be the most competitive candidate you can, because they're not going to initiate a waiver for somebody they don't believe they're going to give admission to, right? So that's really what the bottom line is. The more competitive you are, and if they believe they would give you an appointment or an admission, then they're going to take the time to initiate the waiver. If they don't believe you're competitive or they're not going to offer you admission, they're not going to use the time, the valuable time of doctors at the academy to determine whether or not you should get a waiver if they never plan to admit you anyway. Let's just say you get an Army ROTC scholarship and you're competing for West Point, where you're considered for a waiver for ROTC, but then West Point determines you're not competitive. You receive a waiver for Army ROTC, but you're not even considered for West Point, right? So there could be that dynamic. You also see other dynamics, for example, where you have a person who is a high school senior who is a top football player, for example, for say West Point. And, they have a number of waivers that they have to clear. Well, the academy wants them there. And so they're going to push the waiver initiation for a candidate they really want to get in. So it's really at the discretion of West Point. It's not necessarily your whole candidate score or how competitive you are. It's also, do they want you there? Are you going to enhance the academy in some way? As a matter of fact, the Department of Intercollegiate Athletics at the academies have a person on their staff who works with the surgeons to the United States Military Academy surgeon, Air Force Academy surgeon, the medical people to grease the skids on these waivers.
They're looking holistically at the entire class. And so when it comes to the academy specifically, Air Force and West Point and Coast Guard and Merchant Marine tend to initiate waivers as if they think a candidate is competitive. On the contrary, the Naval Academy pretty much has to decide that they're going to offer you an appointment, not just that you're competitive, but that you're going to be offered an appointment. So from a timeline perspective, chances are if you're applying to, let's say, Air Force and Navy academies, you might enter the waiver process for Air Force before you enter the waiver process for the Naval Academy. You may never enter the process for the Naval Academy, but they're looking at students, just like you said, sir, and making a determination as to whether or not they're competitive. Let's say you start the DoDMERB process in July and you go to your exams in August 1st, 2 weeks later, those exam results have been sent off to DoDMERB, and a week later, late August, you find out that you've been disqualified. You have a much better chance because you are earlier on in the process of going into the waiver phase. So time is on your side here. You want to get things in early if you're going to be disqualified. That's a really key item. So let's say that this candidate has asthma, that they were diagnosed at 14, and they're applying to the academies and the ROTC scholarships, and the academies have said, okay, you're under waiver review. That moves us to step 7, sir, of under waiver review.
They're going to be looking at you for the waiver, right? You may get additional medical instructions, okay, or what we call AMIs. So what they're doing is they're asking you to get additional medical tests or medical documentation in order for them to make a determination whether or not you should receive a waiver or not. And so they'll give you some options here. They'll say you can use a government contracted person, right, or at the government's expense, or you can do it at your own expense, which would be the kind of the do-it-yourself. Recommend very strongly that you do the do-it-yourself and you pay out of your own pocket. The reason is because you want to make sure that everything that you send paints you in a positive light. And so the more positive information that you can have, the better. The problem with just using the government contractor is if the government contractor sends up a negative finding, then you might be denied the waiver. Whereas if you do it yourself, if you get a negative outcome from one doctor, you can then go to another doctor and maybe get a different outcome because doctors have different opinions about things. You want to use your own doctor so that you can control the process of medical information that is provided to the waiver authority through DoDMERB. So remember, you control the process. And this can also be like notes from, say, teachers. This could be notes from military individuals that vouch for the person. You can send up to DoDMERB any types of materials that you want that will reinforce the case that you're in good health and that you deserve a waiver. However, keep in mind that the waiver authority is mainly going to concentrate on the medical documentation that you send up. Then you get all that stuff together, you send it to DoDMERB. DoDMERB acts as a library for the waiver authority to look at your documentation at DoDMERB to determine whether or not you get a waiver. The waiver authority, whether that's the ROTC program or the academies, make a decision on the waiver.
This takes us to step 8, or waiver decision. And either your waiver is going to be approved or your waiver is going to be denied. Now, this can get tricky if you have multiple disqualifications because you might be waived for certain conditions, but not others. And in order to be granted an appointment or earn a scholarship, you need to be waived for every disqualification you have. So let's break this down a little bit further in terms of what's approved and what's denied. And so, what is usually approved? Now, these are generalities and they change from year to year. But in general, I think it's really important to lay some expectations. Okay, let's go back to our example of asthma. So, if you were diagnosed with asthma, a lot of pediatricians do this. If you have a pulmonary function test that proves that you do not have asthma, you are likely going to be granted the waiver. If you fail the pulmonary function test, you are not going to be granted the waiver. You cannot have asthma. ADHD meds is another example. There is a time limit of 2 years for being on ADHD medication. If it's been a year and a half since you were on ADHD medication and you are doing excellent in your classes and everything is going well and you have teachers supporting you, you have a great chance of getting the waiver. If it's been 2 weeks, you do not have a good chance of getting the waiver. And so that's why planning is so important in understanding those timelines. If you have an orthopedic injury, as long as you are operating at 100% and you are back to normal and you've been back to normal for a certain amount of time, say 6 months to a year, you are likely going to be granted the waiver for orthopedic injuries. Not always, but in general, you will be. So those are just 3 examples of times when candidates often will be granted waivers. And like you said, sir, the recruited athletes, they get help from the coaches. And so that liaison is there operating behind the scenes. But also, I want to be very clear that coach could have their eye on you and not be technically recruiting you and still help you behind the scenes. So that is a good relationship to foster if you can make that happen. Now, there's always the negative situation that we don't want to see, which is that the waiver or waivers were denied. And why were they denied? Well, we can't tell you exactly why they were denied because, again, these considerations and needs of the service change from year to year. And at the end of the day, these surgeons are making decisions based on the need of that branch. And so if there are less Army officers required in 4 years, there's probably going to be less waivers given out in that certain year. But there are some very common disqualifiers that we very rarely see waived. And some of those are allergies, which we actually discussed allergies with a Air Force allergist. And so we're linking that video right here for you to go take a look at that. This is not seasonal allergies. This is not hay fever. This is, I go into anaphylactic shock if I eat peanuts, or I'm allergic to shellfish and I have to carry around an EpiPen. So just keep that in mind because a lot of people see allergies and think, oh, I have seasonal allergies, I'm going to be disqualified. But also any history of self-harm or suicidal ideations or serious mental health issues are very, very difficult to overcome. Sir, can you think of any other qualifiers that are very difficult to waive?
Yeah, things like heart conditions are very, very difficult to overcome, like having a pacemaker or things like that, that indicate that you won't be able to be in a place that has austere conditions that generally will require you to be denied a waiver. So anything that requires medication to sustain yourself, because you can't count on that medication if you're in a deployed situation. So anything that requires any type of sustainment medication will be denied. If your waiver is denied, you have a chance really to what we would call step 9, which would be to appeal. So you can appeal the waiver denial, right? So that would be, in most cases, you'll appeal a denial if there's a particular additional medical evidence that you didn't provide earlier that tells the waiver authority that, hey, we didn't give you this particular information, or we don't believe you consider this information. And I've seen this in a number of cases where you're in the middle of trying to get some additional medical documentation together, and then the academy or ROTC programs makes a decision on your waiver and denies your waiver. And then you say, well, I have this additional medical information I'd like to provide you that will hopefully overturn or make you reconsider your waiver decision. So what you do is you go through DoDMERB and your manager and ask them that you'd like to appeal the denial of whatever the waiver was denied for due to additional medical evidence that you'll provide them. And so you should try to do this as soon as you have that medical evidence, and certainly within a month, you'll want to go ahead and get that additional medical evidence up to DoDMERB. So after that time, maybe about another month before the decision comes back on the appeal, whether or not they grant the appeal, and then they would consider your additional medical documentation. And then finally, if it's denied a second time, you could certainly go and contact your member of Congress. If you truly believe they didn't consider the additional medical documentation, you can have another appeal or try to get your member of Congress to have the academies or ROTC programs consider your additional medical documentation. So remember that if your waiver is denied, you've got to have additional medical documentation that shows the Academy or ROTC program that you should be considered for that waiver.
Before we move on to the final decision, when you're waiting for the appeal, a lot of students don't even know that they can appeal. They think once it says you're disqualified and then the Academy or the ROTC programs come back and they say your waiver's been denied, they think that's the end of the process. And in reality, it's not. You can and you should appeal. When you do that appeal, that actually goes to the superintendent for the academies. So it's out of the surgeon's hand. They're not looking at it, and it's now the superintendent staff. And the superintendent staff is busy. So that's why it can take up to a month for the decision to come back. I think we've seen up to 2 months before for an appeal, but usually between that 1 and 2 month time frame. Once you get that final decision back from the superintendent staff, it's pretty final. The only way it's going to overturn is with a member of Congress really advocating on your behalf, which in the case 2 years ago, we worked with a candidate who had 4 disqualifications. Now, these disqualifications were due to the fact that she completed the questionnaire on her own and she wrote in items that she did not have. She said she was a sleepwalker and various other conditions that she got up in the middle of the night and went to the bathroom and said that that was sleepwalking. So that's why it's so critical that you fill these out with your parents. But the academy came back and some of them were a little bit more serious that she said that she had. And they said, no, we're not going to waive you on these. She appealed. And again, the academy said no, but then she went to her member of Congress and her member of Congress were able to assist her. And she was actually waived on all 4 counts and she was offered an appointment.
After that final decision, then that's pretty much it. You're not going to be medically qualified and you're not going to be able to attend the service academy or sign a contract to do Army ROTC, right, at a college or university. Now, I want to make this clear about ROTC. This does not prevent you from starting as a freshman in college at an ROTC program and participating for up to 2 years as a Army ROTC or Air Force or Navy ROTC cadet or midshipman, as long as you're cleared by a doctor to medically do the various physical activities, and that's just a basic form, then you can participate and do ROTC, right, in college. A scenario that I've seen with a number of candidates is, say, they were on medication for depression and they got off medication 6 months before they go to a military academy. They get their waivers denied because they're not off the medication long enough. Then they go to college. They do ROTC as a non-scholarship cadet or midshipman. They spend that year. They perhaps reapply to the academy. And then when they go through the waiver process next time, it's been a year and a half since they've been off the medication and then they receive that waiver. So sometimes time can be on your side with many of these waivers that are denied, that you can do ROTC for a few years, or even if you need more time, 3 or 4 years, you can go to college, get your college degree, and then go into the service as enlisted on an officer candidate school contract and become a lieutenant or an ensign after 4 years in college. So you have to look at your particular situation and see whether or not more time off medication or recovering from an injury or whatever that may be beneficial for you. Now, there's some medical issues that time does not help. And so in those cases, then you wouldn't be able to take that route. But there's a number of these cases where oftentimes you get in better medical condition that will allow you to receive a waiver after a certain number of years.
For our listeners out there, this is a very complex topic with a lot of variables. And so that's why we exist, to help students overcome these hurdles and understand what their options are. So, in addition to our book, I would also highly recommend that if you have questions about how to overcome a disqualification, that you book a consult with us where we will walk you through the entire process and be there by your side as you're pursuing this waiver to help you achieve a waiver. And we only work with students who we believe have a shot at getting a waiver.
Let's close this out then with the 7 critical steps, and we'll talk about this here. We'll run those through. Here are the 7 critical steps that we believe you need to be concerned about here. First is know when you're going to be disqualified or not. So this talks about the preparation process ahead of time. So look at the DoDMERB medical qualification, or DoDI, Department of Defense instruction ahead of time. Know what you're going to be disqualified for or not. Prepare ahead of time and anticipate that you may be disqualified. 2 is to understand how to start the DoDMERB process, right? Or understand when the DoDMERB process starts, whether or not it's for ROTC of earning a scholarship or making progress on the academy application item. That's the 2nd critical step. 3rd is to make sure that your doctors fix mistakes on paperwork if DoDMETS returns anything to them. So make sure that after you do your exam, that the doctor or the optometrist fixes whatever issues there are with paperwork and make sure it gets up to DoDMERB so that you can have DoDMERB determine whether or not you're qualified or disqualified for that particular issue. 4, if you see that the application from DoDMETS is pending for 10 plus days, make sure you contact the DoDMETS SIP team in order to make sure that the paperwork is properly sent to DoDMERB.
Number 5 is, if you are disqualified, take action immediately. Start submitting evidence that you should earn a waiver. Do not wait. Do not wait for them to consider you for a waiver. You want that information to be in the DoDMERB repository as soon as possible. So that way, when the surgeon looks at you, they can take that into consideration. Step 6 is, they're looking at you for a waiver and they ask you for additional medical information. Do not use one of the free government provided physicians. Go use your own physician, control the narrative, make sure that everything that is sent in is accurate. And lastly, step 7 is, do not take no for an answer. Just because you are not granted a waiver the first time around does not mean it's the end of the road. Appeal, and making sure that you're doing that by submitting additional medical evidence. And if you follow these 7 steps, there's a high likelihood that you're going to be successful, depending on what the criteria are for your disqualification.
That is amazing, Trish. This is obviously very, very complex. A lot of moving parts here. We hope that this podcast and video was helpful to you, and we're here to help you if there's anything you need in order to be able to overcome these DoDMERB issues, or if you need a waiver.